sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgson Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey PowerFact fans, I'm Rick. In the continuing IDPA rulebook saga, I'm going to talk today about the new cover and reloading rules. We've done 2 or 3 or 4 episodes in the past on this, but of course each time there's a rule change, the old episode becomes obsolete. So if you're looking for information on reloading and cover, look for the newest episode. And so here's the newest one. Here we are in the early spring, late winter, I guess we're early spring of 2015. And there's been some changes. The change that everyone was glad to see was the flat-footed reload has gone away. In the 2013 rule book, one of the major changes was getting rid of the round dumping rule. If you've played IDPA for any period of time, you remember round dumping was firing extra shots at targets that didn't need them in order to afford a more favorable reloading position. So for instance, if you wanted to engage a certain number of targets, perform a moving reload as you went to the next target so that you were already reloaded after you arrived, your choices were to either perform a retention reload while you were moving, or run your gun dry so you could do a slide lock reload, which is a little quicker. But firing an extra shot to run the gun dry to afford you that favorable reloading situation was very specifically against the rules. Now, maybe you needed to fire an extra shot. Maybe you noticed that your last shot, the 10th shot that you fired before you were going to do your 11th round reload, was at -3, so you fired another shot as a makeup shot, and oh, lucky me, now the slide's locked back, I can do a slide lock reload as I go. Well, that's perfectly legal. But if you said to yourself, I don't want to carry this round with me over there, I want to get rid of this round, so I'm just going to fire it because I'm allowed to fire as many rounds as I want to satisfy myself in terms of scoring. If I think I want to fire another round at this target, that's perfectly legal, unless I'm doing it just for the specific purpose of running the gun dry. So that rule has always been there's always been some kind of contentiousness about it, because some people say, you're essentially requiring me to read some guy's mind. This guy fires 11 shots and it's perfectly legitimate. This guy fires 11 shots and he's cheating. And how am I supposed to tell, And so one of the major focuses of the 2013 rule book was to get rid of the round dumping rule. And what we got instead, essentially, was the flat-footed reload. And what that did is it essentially established that where you were while you were shooting was your shooting position at cover. And if you ran your gun dry at that point, you could not leave that point, that place, before you had completed your reload. If you intended to reload, you couldn't leave with an empty gun, and you had to complete your reload before you left. So imagine like when you're shooting the classifier, you're at the barricade, you're shooting string 2, stage 3, you're firing 2 rounds at each of the paper targets, your gun is empty, and you have to reload before you advance to the barrel. So it's essentially establishing that theory of cover and engagement for every shooting position on a course of fire. Once you've engaged from this spot, if you're going to reload, you've got to do it before you leave. And there was a very specific set of rules, a little bit of a dance that you could do. You could lift 1 foot, and that wasn't considered leaving or advancing, but if you lifted both feet, even if you didn't go anywhere. I mean, I'm lifting both feet right now, but I'm not advancing. I mean, the rules said you cannot advance on the stage. But you could obviously lift both feet multiple times and not actually advance. So that brought on its own problems. If you're not going anywhere, why does it matter if you lift both feet? So it turned into one of these rules where by enforcing the letter of the rule, people are getting penalized for not really violating the theory. The spirit of the rule is don't leave before you've unloaded, before you've reloaded. but I get a penalty even though I haven't gone anywhere because I've lifted both feet. And so there was just a kind of general unhappiness with that rule. So another round of, okay, let's revise this and make people happy. And so we've gotten rid of the flat-footed reload, but what's been retained is this idea that if I've fired shots from this point, this is the shooting position, the cover position. And if I run my gun dry, I cannot leave this position with an empty gun, and I can't reload as I move from this position to the next one. And except under specific circumstances that we'll get into. Now that is a huge change for some people. In the pre-2013 world of IDPA, I would say there was not just a common belief, but a prevailing belief that as soon as I was finished with my engagement of this target, the last target from this cover position, that now my concern about cover is the next target. So that as soon as I'm done with this one, now cover is no longer here, cover is over there. And so I can move over there, I can go from here to there with an empty gun, I can reload as I go from here to there because cover is over there. It's between me and the target that I'm going to engage. And I don't care anymore about the target that I've already engaged. So as an example, more visual aids. Here you are at position 1 to engage T1, and then you're going to move to position 2 to engage T2. So if you run your gun dry here, in 2012, a large proportion, maybe even the vast majority of the IDPA clubs and matches in the country would have allowed a reload as you moved from here to here, because this wall essentially covers you from T2. And so essentially, you're never out of cover. Nowhere you are on the range is out of cover, because when you're standing here, you're covered from T1 by P1. As you move to here, you're covered from T2 by P2. So you're moving and reloading and anywhere you want to, because the theory that says over there is cover. And since I'm covered, I can go over there. I can leave here, go there. I'm not actually leaving cover because cover is over there. I'm approaching cover, and I'm covered so I can reload. Well, that theory is out the window. If that's the way you were playing IDPA a couple of years ago, where I can't see any unengaged threats, so I'm behind cover, that theory no longer applies. So you're going to have to accept the new reality that once you have fired shots from a spot, you have established that as a cover position, a shooting position, and if you run your gun dry, you cannot leave that spot until you've finished reloading your gun. And I mentioned on one of the forums that I said at our club, we never adopted the old way of thinking. You know, we essentially, for us, it's like a return. The rules are returning to the way they've always been. If I'm here, I can reload here. I can run over there and reload over there, but I can't reload between here and there because between here and there is open ground. If you looking at it this way, you think, looking downrange, you think to yourself, oh, this wall is covering me. But if you look at it this way, you're actually covering this open, unexplored territory. When you leave P1, you're essentially leaping into the unknown. And in a self-defense situation, what person would leave a cover position where they're safe behind cover and run out into who knows what with an unloaded gun? And if you are already a member, that essentially was the explanation provided by Joyce Wilson to the membership in an e-blast, was that's the justification why you can't leave P1 for P2, because this is unexplored open ground. And another thing that has come in that kind of supports that theory is the return of surprise or appearing targets. For many years, although my understanding is it was widely ignored, is you cannot have a target appear as you move from one position to another. You engage from this position, you move to this position to engage some more, but nothing will reveal itself while you're moving from here to here. Well, that has also changed. We are now allowed to have, we've got now a definition of a vision barrier, which is something that blocks your view of the target, but which is not cover. So when you leave P1 for P2, in some courses of fire, you are going to have targets that will be revealed as your perspective changes. As you left P1, for instance, a wall would be blocking the view of the target, but as you got down range, now the target is revealed. And so that is a possibility. And so every course of fire, whether it has an appearing target or not, you're going to be acting as if a target might appear. So you must reload your gun before you leave P1 to head to P2. If the gun is empty, you've got to reload it before you go. And you can't do tack load. This is just a run from 1 to 2 unless a target appears along the way. Now that again is going to be, it's requiring some interesting changes in thought processes. The rule book includes some diagrams. I'm just blowing this up for use on the show here. As you can see, if you're starting at P7 and moving, you've got your T7 is the target that will be engaged from P7. T8 will be engaged, and when I say from, I mean utilizing the cover of. That's another thing, is that there is no requirement that you go to a cover position. Cover is the position from where you are shooting and properly utilizing cover. So for instance, if we've got each of these targets, you can actually engage from anywhere along the cover line. So this line to T9 that runs through P9, you can engage T9 from anywhere along this line. As long as you're pieing the edge of P9, there's no requirement that you go to P9 to engage T9. And so you've got, for instance, in this example, if you are leaving P7 to engage T8, you do not have to go to P8 to do so. You can stay moving on a direct path towards P9 and just pause right here to engage T8. You don't have to move in the direction of P8 to engage T8. You just have to pie the edge of this cover and remain within cover along this line. And so when this was posted on, the discussion started on the forum about when are you in cover, when are you out of cover. My post was, I'm going to leave P7 and head directly towards P9, and I'm in the open while I'm doing that. And then somebody else posted, no, you're behind cover. You're behind the cover of P8 as you move towards P9. And I said, no, that's the 1912, or 1912. That's the 2012. It might as well be 1912. That's the 2012 way of looking at things. The idea that this wall is blocking your view of T8 means that it's also blocking T8's view of you, and so you're behind cover. That's gone away. The move from this point to this point is in the open. And wherever you stop to engage T8, that becomes the cover position, the shooting position. So if you were to say engage T7, move to this point, fire the required number of rounds at T8 and ran your gun dry, you could not move from this point before you'd completed your reload. Because the first step that you take towards P9 is again moving back into the open. You're leaving cover and moving into the open. So you have the option of shooting here, going down range to engage T8, moving laterally to engage T9, going right up to the edge of the cover. Or again, you can just move straight across from P7 to P9, pausing here to engage T8. But if you do, it's as if, for cover purposes and reloading purposes, it's as if you advanced all the way down here to P8 to engage. Once you've run your gun dry here, there's no advancing until it's reloaded. And again, I think some people are going to have a hard time understanding that concept of if I'm standing out. I mean, to me, I look at it and go, you're clearly standing out in the open. I mean, you're completely exposed all the way around, you're out in the open. But other people look at it and go, no, 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 I'm not in the open. You know, I'm behind the cover of P8 here. But as soon as you've fired a shot at T8, you've established that position as the position from which you reload if your gun is empty, and you can't advance to P9 until you've reloaded. So just, you know, kind of ruminate on that. And where I think it becomes more distinct is in the exceptions. The rule book says that the exception is if you're entering a hall or a room. And a hall and a room is defined as covering you on 2 or more sides. So clearly, as you're moving, if you've got one wall that's parallel to the back berm, and you're advancing to another wall that's downrange but also parallel to the back berm, as in the earlier example, you're in the open because the only place there's cover is that downrange wall. You're covered only on one side. But if your cover is in entering a hallway, you see here that if you're at P4, after engaging T4 from cover, you're going to move to P5. You're entering a hallway where you're covered on your left and your right. And the rule book allows an exception that if you're entering a hall covered on 2 or more sides, you may reload on the move from one cover position to another, and you may leave P4 with an empty gun to do so. So for instance, if I were shooting this stage, if this were a single stage, I engage T1 from P1, I can move from P1 to P2 because I have continuous cover. It's a continuous piece of cover that covers me as I move. So I can reload from P1 to P2. I engage T2 and T3 from P2. I cannot cross P2 or P3 with an empty gun, and I cannot reload as I move from P2 to P3 because I'm moving in the open. I don't have contiguous cover, even though there's no visible targets. That's the other thing. You're gonna have, if you've been playing under these 2012 rules that most people have been playing under, you're going to want to think of cover as being tied to where the unengaged threats are, but that's no longer the case. The old rule that said, you know, you can't cross an opening, you can't cross a port, that's still the case, but even if there's no unengaged threats, you can't do so. So to cross this port, your gun would either have to be already loaded. If there's rounds in it, you can cross. You can wait until you cross to reload, but you can't leave P2 and reload as you go. And you can't leave P2 with an empty gun. You'd have to reload before you go. So then you advance from P3 to P4. If you want to reload between P3 and P4, you can. So if you've got one round in your gun after engaging T3, you can carry that one round across this opening to P3, from P2 to P3, and then perform a retention reload, while moving from P3 to P4, because you're back to continuous cover. So you've got to start thinking of cover more as a thing, a place, an object, than this state of being, the sense that I can't see any threats, so I'm behind cover. Get rid of that and start thinking of where you are on the range relative to these cover positions. So you're going to arrive at P4, engage T4, and again, because you're entering a hallway where you're covered on 2 sides, you can leave P4 with an empty gun, and you can reload while moving to P5. Now, P5 is a shooting position outside of a room. And again, you're covered on more than 2 sides while inside the room. So after engaging T5 from P5, you can leave P5 and move towards P6 and reload as you go. Or even if your gun is run dry at P5, you can move to P6 and reload as you go. You can leave P5 with an empty gun. And because, of course, there's no ban on round dumping, if you want to do a slide lock reload as you move from P5 to P6, if you want to fire 3 or 4 shots at T5 so that you can do a moving slide lock reload from P5 to P6, that's legal. Now, what you can't do is re-engage T5 after you've left. All the engaging of T5 must be done from P5 before you leave P5. You can't re-engage as you move across here. But then once you've arrived at P6, you'll engage T6, and that'll be the end of the course of fire. So again, at my club, this is the way we've been doing it for 15 years. But at a lot of clubs, the way they would have previously done it is they would have reloaded from P1 to P2. They probably would have reloaded after engaging T2 and T3. They'd say, oh, there's no more threats, so I might as well reload as I go from P2 to P3. And then, of course, they'd reload from P3 to P4. After engaging T4, they would reload from P4 to P5. After engaging T5, they'd reload from P5 to P6. So, but you have to, so for some clubs, it's going to be a matter of differentiating between the way you've always done it when you're in a hall or a room and treating it differently when you're in the open. So this idea of how many sides are you covered on, and has nothing to do with unengaged threats, engaged threats. If you're covered on one side as you advance, you cannot leave the initial position with an empty gun, and you can't reload as you go. But if you're entering a room or a hallway, you can. And those are the two examples. And the other thing that came up, which I thought was very interesting, is that they say, even though the rule book says it's not always possible to set up all of the props that you'd like. So for instance, you could put a chair in the middle of the range and say, that's the driver's seat of a car. That's perfectly legal. All these targets have to be engaged while you're sitting in the car. Then you leave the car to go engage these other targets. That's perfectly legal to do that, simulating a car with just a chair. But what you cannot do is simulate a room. So for instance, you could not set up a stage like this and say, oh yeah, you're in a room here. Just imagine that there's a room. So you can go ahead and reload as you run from here because, there's a wall here and there's a wall here. Yeah, it's fine. It's a room. Yeah. And of course, if it were allowed to do that, I'm sure a lot of people would. They'd set up this stage and just say you're in a room. But because the rule book has said very specifically, these specific reloading rules apply only when you're in a hall or in a room, we're going to require that you actually build the room. Now, we ran these stages from the rule book. These illustrations are from the rule book, and we ran these at our match last month. Just to kind of reinforce the new rules. And this was my stage. This was my stage that I set up. And so to illustrate the stage, to have it make any sense, we started downloaded at P1 to ensure that you would run your gun dry on T4, and then everybody would do a slide lock reload while moving from P1 to P2. And then after the match, the complaints were we couldn't see what was going on in there. The shooter was getting the benefit of reloading and moving and seeing the differences between a room and a hallway and moving in the open, but the gallery couldn't see anything because this was a solid wall. And I was thinking, okay, the rules say I can't simulate the walls, but if all I need for it to be considered a room is for the shooter to be covered on two sides, I could get rid of this wall. This could be a safety issue. I think if you've got a shooter, let's say, who's taping this target and you can't see him because of this solid wall, I think that's a safety issue. And either deleting this wall or making it making it a waist-high wall or something. And I think you can completely get rid of it because once the shooter arrives at this position, his focus is always going to be downrange. He's not even going to be aware that this wall is here. So while it's a good idea for the purposes of the illustration, and the rules do say you can't simulate a room, it has to actually be a room, I think since we've got this wall enclosing what the shooter can see, as he's looking at T5, he wouldn't know if this wall was here or not. And so I think I'm hoping that that's going to be the case, that a hallway is covered on two sides, a room is covered on three sides, and you can leave this open. But again, you've got to actually build a room to have the special circumstances for cover and reloading to take effect. Now, the other unusual rule, I'm not really sure what was driving it, is the rule book says after engaging, let's say you've come to position 3 here, and position 2, I'm sorry, after engaging T3, you decide that you want to re-engage T2. You do not have to reassume the cover position for T2 to re-engage it. You can re-engage T2 from the cover position that you've established for engaging T3. And again, the rulebook says very limited circumstances. I mean, it's not like any time you have 2 targets that you're engaging, you only have to use one cover position. But under this very limited circumstances of having completely engaged the first target, you realized while you're engaging the second one that the first one needs some more, you're allowed to maintain your T3 cover position to re-engage T2. And again, I'm not interested to see how it pans out, and I'm also interested to know why it's that way. I mean, why do we have a new rule that allows us to engage a target out of cover? And that's what it amounts to. In these limited circumstances, under this very limited circumstances, you may re-engage a target out of cover. And it's going to be very dependent on how stages are set up to see how often it comes up, or if it turns into some kind of a slick gimmick that people are able to exploit. I'm not really sure. But anyway, so that's a kind of an interesting rule. Under those limited circumstances, you don't have to use cover to engage a target. But again, if you're get on board with this concept of open ground when you're covered on only one side and you're moving. Don't reload, don't run your gun dry. You have to cover open ground with a loaded gun. And then, of course, that brings up another subject. There are very specific rules about when you run your gun dry in the open. So if I leave cover, I'm in this position here, I leave cover, headed from P1 to P2. Well, what if there were an appearing target over here? I've engaged T1, let's say this is towards the end of a stage instead of at the start. So I'm starting to run low on ammo. I engage T1. I've got 1 round left in my gun. As I start moving down range, I get to about here, and here's a target that's been revealed here with a short wall, blocking my view of it from P1. But by the time I get down to here, I can see it. Well, now I fire 1 round at it. I'm at slide lock. The rules allow me to initiate a reload while continuing to move to P2. But now, by the time I have arrived at P2, now this target that I was engaging from uprange, now I'd be breaking the 180 if I engaged it. If it were located about here, by the time I actually arrived at the position from which I want to engage this target, I've sort of overrun it. Can I go back? The rules say if you run your gun dry and you can safely re-engage a target, you're allowed to and may safely re-engage, you can. But for instance, what I threw out was, okay, if the target is right here, I can't very well come around on the downrange side of it to use the cover of P2 to engage it, because then I'm further violating the 180 by moving even further downrange. But so apparently cover is not available to engage this target. So after I've completed my slide lock reload, really, under these circumstances, you'd probably be better off to just stop. If the target were right here and you're moving along this line, you run your gun dry. If you continue moving and continue reloading, you're going to overrun the target, or you're not going to be able to engage it. But the rules say if you do an open moving reload, you can't re-engage until you arrive at cover. Well, there is no cover, because again, if you went around on the downrange side of P2, then you're still breaking the 180. That's not going to work. So it's going to be interesting to see how these appearing targets, moving reloads, crossing the open, how it all plays out. And a lot of it, I think, is going to have to be dependent on how a specific rule is interpreted for a specific course of fire, dependent on exactly how the targets are laid out. Are you going to overrun this target? You're going to shoot at it once, overrun it, and just blow it off. You're going to say, I'm going to get a penalty, a miss penalty, because I only fired 1 at it. I'm going to get a penalty. Do I get a penalty there's a rule that says you do not have to engage a disappearing target. So after I've run past it, I can no longer engage it. Did it disappear? Does disappear mean I literally can't see it? Or does disappear mean from where I am, I can no longer have the opportunity to engage it? So if I run right by it after I fire one round, guns at slide lock, I do my moving reload on the way to P2, I get a miss, but do I get a penalty for not engaging it with 2? Or is it a disappearing target because it's no longer available and all I get is the 2.5 second penalty? And do I decide that I'm willing to accept a 2.5 second penalty and not have to go back and engage it? I'm just going to keep going, complete my slide lock reload, and engage this target from here. So there's some, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. We've only had one match under the new rules. There was an appearing target stage. And I'm not sure if that played into it. Again, it's just going to depend on how the stages are set up. But there's going to be some interesting opportunities, I think, for firing extra shots and not firing the required number of shots. I mean, that's one of the other kind of little changes that I just kind of was made aware of last week is failure to engage targets with a required minimum number of rounds is now a per target penalty. So if you run right by a target and don't engage it, or you only engage it with 1 rather than 2, you're going to get a penalty for each target that you do that. It's not like in the old days where it's only 1 penalty for all circumstances, 1 penalty for each type of infraction. Specific exceptions have been made, and now this is one of them. Any target that you don't engage with a minimum number of required rounds, you'll get a penalty. So let's say you had a stage with 5 targets to be engaged 3 rounds each. If you had a mine fart and engaged them with 2 rounds each, that would be a 5 penalties, 1 per target, for not engaging them with 3 rounds each. So it can be a pretty hefty penalty, but I think that's to counter exactly this kind of thinking that I've described, where I'm going to calculate, okay, if I blow off that target and run right by it after putting 1 round on it, I can accept a 2.5 second penalty and get away with that and actually benefit from it. And I think some of these penalties are designed to prevent that kind of thinking. It's like, okay, a 2.5 second penalty plus a PE for not engaging with a minimum, maybe an FTN if the 1 round I put on it wasn't a good hit. The penalties are going to be too great. But again, I think there's going to be some interesting situations with these rules involving you may start your reload on the move, but you can't engage any targets until you arrive at cover. There's no requirement that when you leave cover and you know there are appearing targets out here that you have enough rounds in your gun to completely engage them. What happens if, my answer to that would be reload before you go. If there's 2 targets out here to be engaged 2 each, you know when you leave cover you need 4, you better reload before you go if you've only got 3. Again, you may be able to leverage some of the details in the wording of the rules to actually get an advantage in certain circumstances from running your gun dry. Other stages, you're going to get an advantage from doing a tactical, on-the-clock tactical reload, optional, or always optional, but you're going to get a benefit from choosing to do one before you go. And it's just, again, going to be a matter of how many targets are there out there, how many rounds per target, what happens if I run dry, what happens if I'm unable to complete my reload, or I'm unable to engage after completing my reload. So just be very aware of how the stages are set up and how all of this stuff is going to play out. But we're going to do some live action stuff. We'll get out to the range and do some demonstrations of this. I just wanted to kind of run over just kind of the basics of how things are going to change. And everybody just needs to be aware of this idea that if you're only covered on one side while you're moving, you're in the open, and you cannot leave cover into the open with an empty gun. You cannot reload while crossing open ground. So you're either going to have to carry the number of rounds that you have in your gun with you, or you're going to have to reload before you go under these circumstances. And then conversely, when you're entering a room or entering a hall, you may leave cover with an empty gun, and you may reload while moving to the next position. So just be aware of those circumstances. And also, again, be really aware of, is this a room? If there's 2 walls, is that a hall? Is that a room? And I was thinking, well, what if you had a Cooper tunnel that was downrange? You leave cover, you're crossing open ground, and then when you go into the Cooper tunnel, do the rules of the hallway apply because there's walls on either side? So while I'm in the tunnel, I can do a reload. But then as soon as I've exited the other side of the tunnel, I can't engage. I can't continue my reload. So there's just going to be some interesting, it's very early days. I think a lot of things are going to get settled this summer at the big sanctioned matches. We're going to have determinations made on a certain stage that maybe are going to be kind of a precedent that then will be followed, around the country. People will say, did you see what they did at the XYZ state championship? And people are going to say, oh, I don't think they did that right. And there's going to be a consensus, oh yeah, they did do it right. So then every time you see that stage in the future, it should be interpreted the same way. And so I think we not only have the verbiage in the rule book that tell us how it's supposed to be done, but then when we start seeing stages shot under these new rules, people will start to get a better feel for, okay, this is what they meant. This is how it's supposed to be enforced. And I think there was a definite lack of that, frankly, over the last 15 years. You had situations like, for instance, I mentioned that we have, again, appearing targets, surprise targets that pop up. When we ran our state championship here in 2011, I wanted to reuse stages from prior matches, and a couple of them had pop-up targets. You either stepped on an activating platform that caused them to appear, or just a change of perspective. You'd run past a tree or something and there'd be a target behind it. And we had a lot of stages like that. I was told flat out by Robert Ray, you cannot do that. You can engage targets while moving to the initial cover position, but after you arrive at cover, every target will be engaged from cover. No appearing targets, And so I remember there was a discussion on the forum about it, and I said, well, hold it, guys. I was told by Robert Ray 3 years ago that you can't do that. And the guy's response was, well, I never contacted Robert Ray, so he never told me, so we continue to do it that way. And so hopefully we won't have circumstances like that. We won't have somebody, coming up with an interpretation of a rule that they think fits, but then even when they're told, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it, they still go, oh, that's, that's the way we've always been doing it. So I'm hoping that there's a little more kind of sharing of knowledge. There's not the same kind of regional, like in some parts of the country, apparently you're allowed to have 1 foot hanging out as long as the other one isn't hanging out before you get a cover call. We'll have a standardized definition of no part of the lower body, for instance, for cover calls. This concept of open ground will be embraced, by everybody. And I'm hoping that once everybody gets on board with these theories, we won't see as much anomalous kind of outlying interpretations of things. And everybody will be a lot happier, and it'll be more fun. And people that travel around the country won't look at a stage and go, whoa, hold it, I'm supposed to do it this way? Because I know our local guys would travel around the country, and they said we were always at a disadvantage because we were always reloading everybody else is reloading in places where we're never allowed to. This open ground theory that we have been using for 15 years, and now everybody is going to be using, had been replaced by this, I can't see any threats, so I'm behind cover. And I guess because we're isolated up here, we never got the word that cover wasn't a place. It was like this mental state of, even if I'm standing out in the middle of an open field, if I can't see any threats, I'm behind cover. That seemed to be the prevailing view, and that's, again, now been replaced with this idea that if you're at a place where you're shooting, that's your cover position, your shooting position, and all reloading and movement is based on that idea of where you are, not where you're going. So we'll see how it plays out. Again, we'll do a range episode later. We'll set up some of these stages and do some live fire demos. And until then, just kind of chew on this idea of open ground and the exceptions for the room and the hallway, and safe shooting.